It's my real pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Professor Eleonora Stoppino, who has been an astonishingly productive scholar for such a young scholar. Her genealogies of fiction, women warriors in the dynastic imagination in the Orlando Furioso, Exhibit A, just came out 2 years ago with Fordham University Press, and in fact it won this year the American Association for Italian Studies Book Prize, which is the highest honor that is awarded by the AIS. So congratulations to It's a really wonderful book. It has, I think it makes a number of significant contributions. Among them, one is its focus on the romance and the cantata tradition that lies behind Ariosto's poem. Another is that it focuses on a woman warrior, Bradamante, arguing, I think, very persuasively that she is the main character in this poem. And third, that Ariosto's main patron was Isabella d'Este, so he was really writing about a woman for a very powerful woman in Renaissance. Professor Stoppino has not only written on Ariosto, even though she has also a number of articles on him. She's written on Amazons, she's written on Quattrocento epic cycles, she's written on the great philologist Erich Auerbach, and she's written on the interface between the demands of the once new print medium and emerging paradigms of authorship. She also has an edited volume forthcoming with Ashgate Press, which she has co-edited with Wendy Hill of Princeton, called Performing Horror, From Epic to Opera. And she is at work on a new manuscript, which we'll hear about tonight, which she has called Ugly Beasts, Talking Monkeys, Animals in Medieval and Renaissance Culture. She's kept herself very busy. Her impressive list of fellowships speaks for itself. She has been a fellow at Villa Itati in Florence. She has had an ACLA fellowship, a Mellon fellowship, and a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study at the University of Illinois. And I will just add that I'm very struck by the fact that Professor Stoppino's teaching at the University of Illinois, where she has been since, I believe, 2006, focuses, I think, on really more medieval authors such as Dante and Boccaccio, and she more or less, I think, had to remake herself as a Dantista and as someone working in Trecento since going to Illinois from Dartmouth and from Berkeley, where she received her PhD in 2003. So I'm very impressed by the fact that she's continued to focus on Renaissance texts while teaching almost exclusively medieval ones. That said, I think one of her many strengths, which you can see in her book and which we will certainly see tonight, is her ability to move gracefully back and forth across the problematic boundary of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, just like Ariosto, the poet on whom she's focused for so many years. In fact, the conclusion of her genealogies of fiction, which I really encourage you all to read, usefully identifies the Orlando Furioso as a kind of hybrid poem, written by a poet as conflicted in his own loyalties as the women who figure so prominently in it. I'm delighted that Nora Stoppino has come to New York, not just for one presentation, but for two. I was very fortunate as one of the students that she spoke earlier today of her Renaissance love, i.e. Ariosto. And tonight she will, with you and with all of us, move backwards toward her medieval interests. Her discussion for tonight, her talk for tonight, is called Deadly Companions, Animal Contagion Between Boccaccio and Fracastoro. So,
thank you. Thank you. That is very excessively generous. I want to thank Jane Tylus for inviting me, the Italian Studies Department, for being so generous. Is it okay? Closer? Yes. I'll get closer. So thank you again, and thank you all for being here. Can you hear me? A little more, huh? Yes, I am resistant. I resist microphones. So let's see. Now, in the last decade, the medical establishment, the mass media, and the general public have linked the most frightening global epidemics with animal contagion. Mad cow disease, the avian or so-called bird flu, and in very recent days, swine flu, are clear examples of a shared terror of pandemics that can cross the boundaries between species and are therefore more dangerous and difficult to defeat. The fear that contagion can spread across the limit between humans and non-humans is so strong that these illnesses are named after animals, be they birds, cows, or pigs, even though they are not necessarily the vectors of infection. Such alarm, however, does not seem to be only a consequence of mysophobia or of the threat of animal contagion multiplying the occasions for contracting illnesses. If an animal, non-human, can transmit its disease to a human, then the identities of the species enter a destabilizing state of crisis. It is precisely this identity crisis, or rather this porous boundary between human and non-human, which will be my focus today, as I attempt to trace some elements of a line that I think leads from Boccaccio to the physician Girolamo Fracastoro, who was born in 1485 and died in 1553, possibly the first proponent of germ theory. I know. All very exciting. Germs, contagion. You think, nice talk on Italian literature, and what happens? In a larger perspective, I am inserting Boccaccio's innovative narration within a change in the representation of the relationship between human and non-human, and within the long and mostly unsuccessful passage from miasma, what you sniff makes you sick, to germ theory. There are tiny particles that are actually animals that actually make us sick. The topic of my paper is an exploration of contagion, animals, and education in the Decameron. It all starts, in many ways, with a toad. I hope you can read this. As you probably remember, in Day 2, Story 7, a toad is found to be the cause of the deadly sage, yes, there is such a thing as deadly sage, that poisons poor Pasquino and then Simona. You remember they're making love in a beautiful meadow, and then he shows off and cleans her teeth with a sage leaf and dies instantly. She says she's accused of killing him. She says it was a sage, and nobody believes her. So she says, look, he did like this. She dies. When dental hygiene and death come together. And I quote, mostra, this I'm going to read a little bit more, mostra che questa salvia sia velenosa, il che della salvia non suole avvenire, ma ciò che ella alcun altro offender non possa in simil modo, taglisi fino alle radici e mettasi nel fuoco. Let's burn it to the ground. Era sotto il cesto di quella salvia una botta di meravigliosa grandezza, dal cui venenifero fiato avvisarono quella salvia essere velenosa divenuta, alla qual botta, non avendo alcun ardire d'appressarsi, fattale d'intorno una stipa grandissima, quivi insieme con la salvia l'arsero, e fu finito il processo di messer lo giudice sopra la morte di Pasquin Cattivello. Boccaccio describes here the elimination of a poisonous element, and at the same time, almost verbatim, recounts the prophylactic activities of the Uffici della Sanità, health offices, instituted in Florence in 1348, because of the plague, then permanently established in 1527. The great medical historian Carlo Maria Cipolla has studied these offices and tribunals and left us with invaluable data on these practices. The episode also illustrates almost pedagogically the functioning of miasma theory, where corrupted air contaminates what it touches. It's the breath of the toad. Interestingly, though, it is an animal the source of the deadly illness. As Cipolla notes, even without the knowledge about what were the real vectors of contagion, so fleas, rats, really no clue about that, but nonetheless the Uffici della Sanità in Tuscany explicitly focused on the containment of animals and their distancing from humans. So they did not understand and couldn't what was the source of a contagion, but they somehow went about the epidemic containing animals. In this circular discourse on the presence of non-human in life that participates, it is this circular discourse on the presence of non-human in life that participates, I argue, of the process that leads Fracastoro, much later, to hypothesize that contagion is not a quality of the air, like Galen thought, but rather an animal process, where seminaria carry the illness from one body to the other. And the actual meaning of what Fracastoro in his foundational text, De Contagione e Contagiosis Morbis, which is published in Venice in 1546, the actual meaning of seminaria, these seed-like qualities, is debated, but certainly there is an animal, I don't want to say essence, but quality to these particles he, for the first time, describes. There is a long line of criticism that has observed how innovative Boccaccio's description of the plague is. Alberto Tenenti, Timothy Kircher, and Ilaria Tufano, among others, have compared Boccaccio's detailed and realistic account of the epidemics to contemporary historians' accounts. And Boccaccio's prose undoubtedly comes out as a new and striking phenomenon. In comparison with Bolognese chronicles that describe the plague, with Ranieri da Pisa, with the Cronaca Senese by Agnolo di Tura, and many others, Boccaccio's account remains quite unique, most notably in the absence of mirabilia, wonders, and in the timing of the description. My contention is that this novel representation of contagion is connected to one of the crucial moments of definition of boundary between the human and the non-human. In this respect, I ask you to keep in mind a few elements. First, the medical revolution fails. It's a failed revolution that only in the 19th century will succeed. I have problems with calling it medical revolution, but it fails. And then, so we are very far from this process being accepted scientific knowledge. The other element I would like you to start considering is the homologous nature of contagion and metaphor. In other words, I'm thinking about texts in a way, texts that talk about spreading of illnesses as spreading contagion themselves. And thirdly, the humanistic project of education, which continues to use animals to teach. So you have, monkeys, for instance, these a chapter of what will be a book is devoted to these babuin de putti, these baboons that are booklets to teach kids how to syllabize. And they're called baboons because what do? We we repeat, we mimic, right, in order to learn. So humanists and a whole educational process uses animals to teach, but at the same time tries to set a very clear caesura, a clear cut between human and non-human. So I won't go today into the distinction between contagion and poisoning that Dag Bio, for instance, has studied, which I think is very productive, but let's not go there. I will try to look at Boccaccio when it comes to contagion, not just as a historical source, and not just Boccaccio as a new kind of historian, even though both elements are present and very important. But I will put Boccaccio at the center of a redefinition of human that deals with contagion as the dark side of education. In the Decameron, the issue of animality takes immediately center stage, and it is associated with constructions of prophylaxis and contagion on one side, and femininity on the other. As always, Contagion, where do you go from there? Clearly you go to women. Across the topographical divide between city and countryside, humans and non-humans trade places in the hierarchy of the living. The animal risk in the Decameron, however, is not just the threat of contagion or of role reversal, but the possibility that distinction itself between human and non-human be lost. In the introduction, the narrator describes the effects of the Black Death over Florence and its surroundings, which will cause the 10 narrators to flee the city and seek rescue and prophylaxis in the countryside. It is striking that, even from a narrative point of view, Boccaccio gives up the surprise effect of the arrival of the plague by saying that the city of Florence was expecting it and tried to keep it out. And I quote, "E in quella non valendo alcuno senno né umano provvedimento, per lo quale fu da molte immondizie purgata la città da ufficiali." So again, he starts by saying officers of the health organs of the city tried to keep it out. Vietato l'entrarvi dentro a ciascun infermo e molti consigli dati a conservazione della sanità, né ancora umili supplicazioni una volta, ma molte in processioni ordinate e in altre guise a Dio fatte dalle diverse persone, quasi nel principio della primavera dell'anno predetto, orribilmente cominciò i suoi dolorosi effetti. The fixed boundary that prevents contagion between humans and animals is immediately shattered. Dico che di tanta efficacia fu la qualità della pestilenza narrata nell'appiccarsi a un altro, che non solamente l'uomo all'uomo, ma questo che molto più assai volte visibilmente fece, cioè che la cosa dell'uomo infermo stato o morto di tale infermità tocca da un altro animale fuori della spezie dell'uomo, non solamente della infermità il contaminasse, ma quel, in fra brevissimo spazio, uccidesse. The effects of the disease spread from humans to non-humans with startling rapidity, and the distinction between human and non-human is underlined and remarked. Furthermore, the effects of the plague over the population are dehumanizing. People turn into beasts. Per le sparte ville e per i campi, i lavoratori miseri e poveri e le loro famiglie, senza alcuna fatica di medico o aiuto di servidore, per le vie e per i loro colti e per le case, di dì e di notte, indifferentemente, non come uomini, ma quasi come bestie, moriano. Per la qual cosa essi, così nei loro costumi come cittadini divenuti lascivi, di niuna lor cosa o faccenda curavano. Anzi, tutti, quasi quel giorno nel quale si vedevano essere venuti la morte aspettassero, non da aiutare i futuri frutti delle bestie e delle terre e delle loro passate fatiche, ma di consumare quelli che si trovavano presenti, si sforzavano con ogni ingegno. Right? Humans lose control of the species that they generally rule over. By losing their primacy and superiority, by losing their hold over the beasts, they open up a space in which the beasts behave in human-like fashion. I buoi, gli asini, le pecore, le capre, i porci, i polli e i cani medesimi, fedelissimi agli uomini, notice the element of, loyalty, fuori delle proprie case cacciati per i campi dove ancora le biade abbandonate erano, senza essere non che raccolte ma pur segate, come meglio piaceva loro se ne andavano. E molti, quasi come razionali, as if endowed with reason, poi che pasciuti erano bene il giorno, la notte alle loro case, senza alcuno correggimento di pastore, si tornavano satolli. They just keep doing their thing. They keep their natural order. What happens in the plague, described in the beginning of the Decameron, is a breaking down of all human conventions. People lose their individuality, their corpses amassed like beasts. The familiar and social ties are severed. Everyone is for him or herself, no kinship survives. People stop working, they abandon their fields and sites of labor that are taken over by the animal themselves. Sex becomes unbridled, and the humans abandon any restraint to give in to lust. Let us keep in mind these four elements of loss: the individual, the social, labor, and sex, throughout this analysis. To go back to this last quotation, the quasi, almost, quasi come razionali, introduces a borderline quality, the movement from rational to irrational, and vice versa. The introduction and loss of distinction between human and non-human is further clarified if we look at tales in which the same distinction is put under pressure. And partly because I just love it, partly because I think it works, I'm showing you this danza macabra. This is, much later, this wonderful genre of death takes us all. And you can see, this is a Clusone in northern Italy near Bergamo, and you see that there's this lovely detail where animals seem untouched and serene in the face of the, horrendous triumph of death that is going on. And that in my mind has a, this meadow-like quality of salvation that we see in the animals in the introduction to the Decameron. From a theoretical point of view, I must say that Agamben's theory of the incongruous body of the animal seems particularly apt to me to describe this uncomfortable attitude Boccaccio displays towards the humanistic distinction between human and non-human. And what Agamben says is this: in our culture, man has always been thought of as the articulation and conjunction of a body and a soul, of a living thing and a logos, of a natural or animal element and a supernatural, social or divine element. We must learn instead to think of man as what results from the incongruity of these two elements, and investigate not the metaphysical mystery of conjunction, but rather the practical and political mystery of separation. So what Agamben really is interested in is all the moments in which this division, distinction, human, non-human, happens. And I think that the Decameron is one of those moments. To explore this problem, I will use 4 novelle in particular, where I see at play a specific strategy that Boccaccio uses to represent both animality and femininity and pin them against each other. I would call this strategy the principle of substitution. In the Decameron, there are instances in which women and animals seem to be interchangeable, and this operation has consequences, not surprisingly. 1. Chickens or of individuality. In Day 1, Story 5, the Marchioness of Monferrato uses an animal metaphor, or a food metaphor really, to get rid of an unwanted suitor, none other than the King of France. The king has heard of the Marchioness' superior beauty and intelligence and is tempted by her fame. He decides to pursue her, even though she's married and of lower station. He goes to her court in the absence of her husband and requires her to host him. The Marchioness, who's embarrassed and knows full well the dishonest intentions of the king, decides to respond with culinary wit and makes her staff prepare a meal entirely constituted by hens. Course after course, the king is served hen and hen only. Knowing that the land is rich in produce and meats, and knowing that he had given ample time to the Marchioness to prepare for the meal, he makes an attempt at seduction that is, at the same time, a protest. Dama, nascono in questo paese solamente galline, senza gallo alcuno. la marchesana, che ottimamente la domanda intese, parendole che secondo il suo desiderio, domine Dio l'avesse tempo mandato opportuno a poter la sua intenzione dimostrare, al re domandante, baldanzosamente verso di lui rivolta rispose: Monsignor no, ma le femmine, quantunque investimenti e in onori alquantro dall'altre varino, tutte perciò son fatte qui come altrove. The dialogue is in true Boccaccio style, a combination of different metaphorical plays. The king complains about the lack of variety, but does so by obviously pointing to the lack of a rooster in the land of the Marchioness, a void that he has conveniently come to fill. The Marchioness brings the complaint back to the lack of variety and uses the hens as a stand-on for women, who are the same everywhere. There is no need, she argues, to go around bothering foreign women of lower class, when you can very well get your hen at home. Even leaving aside this wonderful double turn of meaning that the text sets up for us, the animal as food of the novella is a transparent representation of the woman as prey. The Marchioness demonstration is so clear, almost so sad in its unveiling of the repetitive nature of the conquest, just another hen, right, that the king, humbled, leaves. We too live the story with a sense of puzzlement, especially in the light of a story I'll discuss further along in the course of this paper, where women become goslings. The Marchioness' response has a dehumanizing effect. Through the animalization of the prey, the woman becomes a hen, she achieves a dehumanization of the prey herself. Her scheme takes away individuality, forbidding contact between two specific human beings by reinserting women and men through the rooster in the animal kingdom. In a way, she achieves her goal by turning seduction into consumption. 2. Goats, or of sociality. The animal in the Marchioness story is the substitute for the woman as pure function in the object position given to her by the act of male conquest. In Day 2, the 6th story features another animal substitution that sees the woman as a subject instead. Story 6, you remember, is a rather long-winded account of the sad adventures of Madonna Beritola, a Neapolitan noblewoman who flees her country, pregnant and with a small child, and ends up shipwrecked, losing both children. In the end, all will turn out well, and she will recover not only her children, but also her long-lost husband. But the part that concerns us the most in this story is the episode in which, once alone on the deserted island, where her ship has left her, she has an animal encounter that will ease her suffering, providing her with a surrogate of her offspring. Perché ella, levatasi, la entrò, donde uscita era la cavriola, a goat, e videvi 2 cabrioli, forse il di medesimo nati, i quali le parevano la più dolce cosa del mondo e la più vezzosa, e non essendolesi ancora del nuovo parto rasciutto il latte del petto, quelli teneramente prese il petto e si chiuse, i quali, non rifiutando il servigio, così lei poppavano come la madre avrebbe fatto, e da allora innanzi, dalla madre a lei, niuna distinzione fecero. The familiarity of Madonna Beritola with the goat and her young makes her enter the space of wilderness. And there are great analysis of this tale. Peggy McCracken has done a wonderful analysis of it. Once she is found by the lords of Lunigiana and rescued, the name she goes by is Cavriola, and she refuses to leave without her new family. She insists on bringing with her on the ship both the goat and the kids. Once they reach their destination in the region of Lunigiana, she keeps living with the animals, taking care of them and making sure they are fed. The text is slightly ambiguous, I think, on whether she keeps nursing them or not, but I actually have thought long and hard and I think not. So enough of that. The love for the baby goat remains though, and so does her name. Even more importantly, Beritola's son will recognize her not by seeing her, but because of her scent. And I quote, ricordandosi d'averla molte volte avanti in quel castello medesimo veduta e mai non riconosciuta là, pur non di meno conobbe incontanente l'odor materno. Maternal scent, right? The substitution principle is here at work, unlike in the story of the hens, from the perspective of the woman. It is the female subject that substitutes her children with the baby goats. Here too, however, the substitution is connected with the reproductive aspect of femininity, right? Sexual with the hens, feeding, nurturing the young with the goat. As in other cases in the Decameron, animality and femininity work together as part of the misogynistic discourse. But the misogynistic discourse is not the only element. Madonna Beritola humanizes the little goats while at the same time bestializing herself. And the element of sociality she recovers, thanks to the goat family, is precisely that of a humanized form of affection for the offspring. 3. Mares, or of labor. The story of the mare is another example of the functional substitution. In the last story of the ninth day, Compare Pietro and his wife would like to have the wife turn magically into a mare in order to be able to perform both the duties of the animal and those of the wife. Genius. The magic is highly sexual, as could have been predicted. It is a story told by Dioneo, and it works only for the friend who claims that he's able to turn the woman into a mare. You all remember how. Despite the fact that this story is generally read as an erotic novella on a trick played on two gullible simpletons, it reveals the utilitarian view of animals and human beings as producers of good through labor. When the gullible wife hears the tale of the mare turned woman from the priest, she sees an opportunity for double gain through double labor. Se egli è così tuo come tu di, perché non ti fai tu insegnare quello incantesimo, che tu possa far cavalla di me e fare i fatti tuoi con l'asino e con la cavalla, e guadagneremo 2 cotanti, e quando a casa fossimo tornati mi potresti far femmina come sono. It's perfect plan. The substitution principle is here at work too, with the beast as worker and the woman as worker and sex object collapsed onto each other. So far, we have seen a story in which hens show that women are the same everywhere, a story in which breastfeeding a child and a baby goat provide comparable solace, and a story in which a woman would like to turn into a mare and back in order to be a more productive member of the household. None of these stories contain real transformations. There are no metamorphoses in Boccaccio, but rather wordplays, substitutions of humans with non-humans. Hens become women, a woman becomes a capriola, a little goat, and a woman becomes a mare. And we move then to number 4, goslings, or of sexuality. The hen story in particular is a very good preamble to the 101st tale of the Decameron, the one told by Boccaccio, the narrator, in his defense in the introduction to Day 4. The tale of Filippo Balducci, where women become goslings. The tale, one of the most famous and studied of the book, has been called a parody of medieval nominalism. In it, after the death of his beloved wife, you remember, Filippo retreats into solitude with his only son and prevents him from knowing anything about the world. When the seclusion ends, Filippo's son enjoys the beauties of the world, but what overwhelms him is the vision of a group of young ladies. When he asks what they are, the father, in a last attempt at defending his son from temptation and sin, introduces them as goslings. Papere. This does not deter the son, who demands to be given one, so that he can give her what to peck. Filippo's attempt to prevent sexual desire by changing the words fails. It is interesting to notice that Filippo is trying the same strategy that on paper worked for the Marchioness of Monferrato, right? They're hens. But in that case, the animal metaphor was adding meaning to reality. Women, like hens, are the same everywhere. Here, the metaphor tries to devoid reality of meaning. Women are nothing special. They are just like stupid animals. Both stories function through the substitution principle, and both protagonists try to turn the object of desire into something else, an animal, in order to either make it appear as what it is or cover up its devastating effect. The separation between human and non-human, meant to create a taboo, is only verbal. It not only fails, but it backfires. Filippo is trying to instill a taboo in his son by reinforcing the human-non-human divide. Crashing his plan, the divide fails, and it is the animality imposed on the women that creates an even stronger desire. I will give them to peck. It becomes this animalized, sexualized metaphor. Myra Best has observed that the Gosling story is a metaphorical reformulation of the episode of the plague. In both instances, the narrators attempt to flee the world, illness, death, contagion, by retreating into seclusion. What is particularly interesting in this light is that in both cases, animals play crucial roles. In one case, animals substitute humans by keeping human-like habits. In the other, animals are used as a cover-up for irresistible desire. We have seen that the substitution principle is far from setting a clear distinction between human and non-human. Rather, it seems to play with this distinction. In the Decameron, incongruous bodies become incongruous words. Hens, goslings, goats, mares. The aspects of humanity that are lost in the introduction with the description of the devastating effects of the plague, that is to say, individuality, sociality, labor, and controlled sexuality, are all read through animality in the stories we have read. The animals tend to regain some of the human aspects that the humans have lost. In conclusion, back to the toad. Toads, or of Contagion. This is the same slide we read before. The animal tales we've looked at introduce the unlikely animal theme in the Decameron. In their light, Boccaccio's description of the plague regains a crucial aspect. Boccaccio describes the plague as an animal phenomenon, which includes humans. A century and a half later, Fracastoro's revolutionary ideas on contagion seem to be triggered by a similar kind of observation. Fracastoro says, "Le analogie fra I contagi sono molteplici e tali da poter essere osservate attentamente. There is a contagion of crops and plants that does not affect any animal organism. Another instead," I'm here paraphrasing Fracastoro, "another instead affects animal organisms and spares crops and plants. And among living beings, one hits man, another oxen, yet another horses or others." Another triumph of the death. We'll just keep that there for a second. The presence of the non-human animal in the introduction and throughout the tales operates differently. In the introduction, we have a continuum of life and death that involves everybody. And this is the line this sort of ideal line of thought that goes from this triumph of death. This is it's circa 1446. This is the Palermo triumph of death, and here we see something different. This is really a continuum, human, non-human, in death. I'll show you details in a moment. That this continuum that goes from Boccaccio's description of the plague to an image like this to something like Leonardo's drawings of cat muscles and horse muscles, where you see, I should have brought an image, but something horrible happened to my image, where you see side by side the human skeleton and muscle and the cat skeleton and muscle without even having to comment on it. And in this Triumph of Death, you have what I think is particularly amazing is this horse with death riding it, and I am really hesitant to define this the horse of death. I think this is just a horse that dies like everybody else. You know what I mean? So in the introduction to the Decameron, we have this human-non-human continuity, whereas the controcanto of the tales turns humans into non-humans apparently merely as wordplay, but like the toad, they always come back from the ground, these words turned animals, turned people. What is then at stake in representing animals in the 14th century, at least in this tradition? What is at stake in this substitution between between human and non-human bodies? In the case of Boccaccio, the animal is often used metaphorically, but there is a risk to this operation, which we could call the animal risk. In this operation, the animal evoked through words takes the place of the lost humanity. In the light of the plague of the introduction, the risk of thinking with animals or speaking through animals is clear. The animal risk is the loss of distinction. Representation becomes contagion. Thank you.
Can you take some questions? Yes.
Okay, so I want to come back to the very beginning, and you talked about the humans becoming like animals, and animals becoming like humans. But what's interesting there in that moment is that although Boccaccio says they're behaving rationally, the way they're behaving like humans is they're returning back to where they belong. That is, they're simultaneously behaving like humans, and also like human property, right? And so if we know that we're human primarily on the basis of our being able to domesticate other species, right? Which is one of the things Augustine says. There's a kind of funny thing that's going on in that moment then, where they're simultaneously being rational and also demonstrating quite clearly that they are our animals, and that we've somehow lost sight of that because we're all running around being beasts, right? So I just want to trouble that opening just a little bit.
Yeah, and Carl, that's not only a great question, but I am troubled. I've been troubled. I am always already troubled by this question, because what troubles me in the Decameron, and in that, especially in the toad tale, but also in the description of the plague, is that we have this combination of, fairly straightforward hierarchical thinking on animals. So, they behave like masters when the place of the master is vacant. Exactly in this Augustinian vein. And at the same time, there is this unity in death. Right, this other concurrent element that is in opposition with it, but at the same time, it seems to invoke attention. And since the rest of the Decameron, not the rest of the Decameron is too much, but since I keep seeing both elements in the Decameron, and I don't think that this is resolved. So I'll keep being troubled. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a very basic question, which is, I can't think of any instances Because the association of women with the animals is key, and I was thinking, especially in the Galina story, like her husband is noticeably absent, so she takes up the charge of defending herself with an animal metaphor, which it seems charged particularly. But in terms of men being compared to animals outside of kind of like the proemia of like touching a pig, and the pig is kind of like an animal.
Yes, absolutely, and that's a fantastic question. And the problem with that question is that the last tale of the Decameron has that unnameable husband of Griselda being called a beast, and that is different though. I think that you're absolutely right in the sense that but this is sort of subterranean discourse within the Decameron of rational versus bestial, you know, an Aristotelian undercurrent, and on the various qualities of what being is. And so, you know, that's another element I've been struggling with, because femininity has this very apparently easy woman turning to thing, turning to
That analog, yeah.
animal wordplay. Man has that, which goes back, I think, to Carl's question as well. This idea that, you know, when we talk about man, there's this hierarchy neatly defined. When we talk about then Ulysses, it becomes a little bit more complicated. But
And I noticed in the quote about the toad that the death that is resolved is his death, not her death, which happens when she's demonstrating the Melina. It's all about him.
it's all about him because she's accused, right, of killing him, and that is also that tale. You know, there's this poisoning moment that then gets repeated for us as a sort of as she defends herself, and of course exculpates herself completely by dying. But one, she dies, and two, if we put that in relationship with the plague and with prophylaxis issues, what does that mean? That, you know, we have a sort of a second coming of the illness that we are completely.
And is it mediated by femininity, or is it
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Is it? I don't know. I should know. I'll find out. I'll think about it. Thank you. That's a great question.
I was thinking, in terms of Melissa's question about are men ever compared to animals, one instance is Fracastoro's servant who's called Lucio Porco. So I wonder whether you'd have to factor in a kind of class element, maybe low class men.
Yes. That's
But
a.
of course, as you say, Griselda's husband is one of the more elite men. He could use up being less. I mean, I wonder how, as every commentator, I wonder how easy it is to draw kind of gender lines, like in the example of the Marchioness of Montferrato. I mean, yeah, on some kind of literal level, she's substituting hens for women and stuff, but what she's doing is, you know, she and the king are understanding each other on a metaphorical level. This is a very witty and human exchange that's going on, which she comes enormously well out of. And so the idea that in some way this story is kind of talking about the possible assimilation of women to the level of the non-human animal, I don't know, I don't find that very convincing.
Yeah,
But I wanted to ask, I mean, I wasn't quite sure how you were choosing the animal stories, but one which I find very kind of rich and dense is the story on David Fire about the falcon, the guy with the falcon.
Yes.
And
that's.
So that seems to have this almost kind of Eucharistic quality to it, in the sense he is the falcon that is giving you know, there's very complicated things.
Exactly. This is a Three questions, all great. And the reason why this started as one chapter on Boccaccio in this book, and it's now become two chapters, and I very much fear that it will be a book on Boccaccio, or at least a Boccaccio bestiary that I don't know exactly where to take. And so, on the question of class, the other chapter on this has at this point Cicibio and the gru, crane, and it has the falcon because and there, then let me answer the class first. So there seems to be this line that goes from low base animals to bestiality, and that line doesn't seem to be a continuum, but we have lower class, dehumanized animal-like people, and then we have high class, like like Griselda's husband, responding to a logic of bestialità versus razionalità. And what you ask about, the wit of the Marchioness, and the fact that that doesn't seem to be about animals, is exactly what started me thinking about this. Because when you ask people, are there animals in the Decameron, most people, I did this poll, say, no, not really. Because these are, it's all at the level of wordplay. And so these hands, but then what happens bizarrely is that you find the toad underneath the sage, and the falcon is, I've always read it as a sort of reification of the hen tail, where things become, where that border between human and non-human, which in the hen tail is just a joke, just witticism, in the falcon tail becomes this Eucharistic moment where your highly symbolic animal is sacrificed in your place as a last act of giving. And so I start being really troubled by the purely metaphorical nature of animals in the Decameron. And I'm not sure I'll be convincing, but at least I'll try. And you had another question that I've now forgotten. What was the other question? Oh no, the falcon, yes. Sorry, thank you.
Didn't hear you.
Oh, yeah, we can't hear you. Horses were being humanized. Sort of the opposite thing was happening. I looked at Getson Versailles and this piece on caretakers of horses. And the author refers to them as below the horse. Below the horse. Perhaps.
Yeah, and in that sense, our falcons and horses as animals, as pigs and chickens, that same hierarchy that that exists and that puts us in charge, quote unquote. Not speaking for myself, but you know what I mean. Puts us in charge of animals is reproduced in this sort of pyramid of the living, where you have horses as close to us and pigs, for instance, as not as far from us, but far from us. And so, and that I think exists in Boccaccio. But at the same time, there are other tales sort of that I still haven't started working on, but sort of borderline tales where there are these spaces outside civilization, outside the garden, outside the city, where animals are threatening, wilder, and horses acquire a strange status. So I have to think more about this, but thank you very much.
Question whether there's just injustice.
Off the top of my head, no, but I have to think about it. Thank you.
I just had a question about a word that caught my eye, I think, on your first slide, talking about humans and I think Boccaccio says altro animale or altri animali, un altro animale.
Yeah.
And I just think that's really curious, and I think this whole bit about Agamben's encumbrous body is really compelling, and I'm wondering, just in your understanding or in Boccaccio's kind of framing of things, is this like a very strict dichotomy between humans and animals, or is it this sort of exaggerated extreme of a spectrum that the human is an animal, but in many ways very distinct, or is it like a very strict dichotomy?
Yeah, that is really what I'm trying to get at, and my answer now is incomplete, but is that it's the plague and some reactions to the plague are really a pressure point where we can look at this human, non-human, call it boundary. I really don't like boundary, but you can look at this distinction, and because it is a moment of great reorganization of knowledge in many ways, texts that are very perceptive, like the Decameron, combine competing discourses on it. So that's, for now, is the best answer I got.
I'm really struck by the fact that you have this citation in the prologue, the introduction, and then that Gualtieri is obviously the very end of the Decameron, and Bestialità, I mean, that's not the last, it's really not in the last sentence, but it's very close to the end of the
Yes,
the
because
final
it's in
event.
their discussion
Exactly,
over it.
after
Exactly.
Juneo finishes talking. And so it just makes for, I mean, I've never thought about this before, but it just makes for a very curious symmetry between this contagion by animals at the beginning and this horrible contagion by this man, Gualtieri, at the end. And I just wonder, I mean, like Melissa, I was intrigued by the fact that all your examples really, did engage the women characters, but if this is a fairly, I don't want to say isolated example, but it's clearly a powerful example because it comes right at the end. I'm just wondering what, can you make of this as the other end of the frame that we
Yeah.
see at the beginning and then again at the end with Gualtieri's, horrific attitude against Griselda?
And Teodorinda Barolini has a great argument about the circularity of the Decameron in this sense. I do think that as the text comes to a close and we are supposed to, I have a very gloomy perspective on things, I think, gloomy perspective on things. As the text comes to a close and we are supposed to go back to life after the plague, I always see more of a counterexample in Gualtieri rather than an example on Griselda, and so that the bestiality that has taken over seems to have no recourse, no saving moment at the end of the book, and so I tend to see it as a sort of plummeting back into a society that has lost that sense of hierarchy, order in the beginning of the text, which I think fits if you think of Gualtieri as the ruler but I know that I've been accused of reading too much in Gualtieri and not looking at Griselda in any possible way as a salvific figure, so I wouldn't listen to me on this, but you know, you're supposed to go back to order, and this is the tale that ends it all. That is not an answer. No, it's not. It's a pessimistic take on.
You know, reading it with this particular moment in mind,
Yeah.
it really does create that as a